Today I thought I'd take a look at rent reviews and specifically which type has produced higher rental returns in the modern era. So in retail and commercial, all leases generally include a program rent review, which increases the rent annually at the expiry of that year. The most common retail leases are 5 years long, so I've based my analysis on a 5-year lease, which includes 4 program rent reviews. I've assumed that a tenant is paying $100 in year 1 throughout the entirety of this data series. My analysis focuses on what rent they would be paying at the end of year 5, which typically leads to a market rent review after that, but that's not part of the analysis. The most common rent reviews I see are CPI, which is Consumer Price Index, which is just the measure of inflation, and it's based on WA data only typically, and CPI plus 1%, or fixed increases of 3 or 4 or 5%. These 5 types are the most common that I've seen over my career, and the choice often comes down to negotiation. So firstly, looking at chart 1, CPI is shown in orange since 1952, which is 4 years after we started collecting CPI data, along with CPI plus 1%, which is shown in grey. It's only logical that CPI plus 1% generates slightly higher rents than CPI. In the late 1940s, we experienced a period of very high inflation, around 20%, which is why the data starts at a high level. For example, in 1952, if you'd granted a tenant a lease at $100 5 years earlier, they would be paying $180 at the end of the lease if it was reviewed at CPI plus 1%, and $173 if it was just reviewed to CPI. Looking at 1964, under CPI plus 1% reviews, a tenant paying $100 when the lease started in 1959 would be paying approximately $110 at the end of their lease, and so on. Next, I overlaid fixed increases. A 3% annual rent review produces a rent of $112.55 at the end of any 5-year period. A 4% rent review results in $116.99, and a 5% review results in $121.55. From this graph, we see that during periods of high inflation, CPI-based reviews significantly outpace fixed reviews of 3, 4 or 5%. However, since the 1990s, lower inflation has resulted in the CPI-based reviews producing approximately similar outcomes to fixed increases. I then focus on the modern era starting from 1998, as this marked a slight change in how CPI data was collected and reported. This graph highlights the 2 most common rent reviews I've encountered in my 12-year career, CPI plus 1% and 4%. It shows which years would have yielded a better result under CPI plus 1% versus 4% over the preceding 4 years. Since 1998, a 4% rent review produced a higher rent at the end of the lease in 16 of the years, and CPI plus 1% produced a higher rent in 9 of the years. It's worth noting that this analysis is based on CPI for all groups Western Australia. I haven't analysed data for other states or for Australia as a whole, as most leases in WA specifically refer to the WA CPI figure. I then looked at if you granted 5 leases in perpetuity in 1952, all at $100 starting rent with the different types of annual rent reviews, what would the rent be in 2024? This would show what has produced the highest long-term rental growth over the last 70 odd years. The results are here, but have definitely been skewed upwards by the 2 periods of high inflation that we had in the 1940s and the 1970s. If we don't have periods of inflation like those into the future, I think an analysis over the next 50 years would produce very different results.